Hello and welcome back to SiggyTube. Now in this video, this lesson, tutorial, call it whatever, we're going to start looking at music theory. One thing that I suddenly realized when making the starting point videos is that to understand how to chord, I'm assuming that everybody knows their major and their minor scales and how to get a diatonic chord sequence from it. So I thought I'd make a series of videos that went into those details. Now for guitarists, I'm going to include the keyboard as well and bass, so we get a good basic kind of broad overview. I really believe that every guitarist should understand how the keyboard works, and vice versa, any keyboard player, how they guitar works and so on. So I'm putting them together deliberately so you have a point of reference. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at the keyboard, and then tacked on to the end we'll put the guitar and we'll put the bass as well. So let's get straight into it. Let's start by looking at the keyboard and going back to absolute basics. For many people, you'll know all this, so it will be teaching grandma how to suck eggs, but there might be some bits that you can glean from it, so don't discard everything. And what we'll do is we'll look at the piano first, and then we'll look at the guitar and the bass, and we'll see if we can kind of relate the three instruments together. Okay, now I always like to start off with what I class as a vanilla sound. So in the case of the sound that I've picked, either a piano, so I'm going to load up this rather nice Noir Pure in Contact. I also like to use Rhodes piano, and I've got a Rhodes piano loaded up, and this one is one of my favourites. It's called the Neo Soul Keys version 2. And it is amazing. It's by gospel musicians. It's just an incredible selection of any kind of Rhodes or suitcase piano that you'd ever want. There's a clavier in there as well, and a CP70. If you like the group Keen, you'll know what a CP70 is, because it's pretty much their sound. So we've got our two sounds now. I'm going to use the piano for this particular exercise and intro. So one of the things that drives people away from learning anything to do with theory is notation. Notation and music theory, of course, are completely and utterly related, but you don't have to understand notation to understand music theory. And I've found teaching notation, a lot of students would turn off as soon as you start writing dots. Never understood that myself, because I think the dots are there for a kind of guidance and help, but guitarists in particular, I found really hate the notion of anything to do with dots. But that's only the ones that I've taught. Okay, so the most important understanding of why we are doing this is so that we understand really where everything relates back to. And in music, everything does relate to something, and our ears like the sound of the Western scale, and they are drawn towards certain combinations of notes, and those certain combinations of notes played together are known as chords, and the chords all have a different name. So part of the language of learning music is to understand how those things relate and what their names are and how we can use them. Okay, now that in itself might sound really complicated, but it isn't, because everything is a derivative from what we class as our major scale. And if we look at a piano, our major scale is always the first point that we look at whenever we start music theory. And on the piano, we can look at the piano and we can see that visually we've got these two notes that are black, and then a group of three, group of two, group of three. And that tells us straight away that this note is C. Now the notes within the musical Western scale and the kind of alphabet that we need to learn all generate from this note here, C. Now the first question that people will always ask is, well, why do we always look at C before we look at anything else? When we look at the alphabet, we go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that's our musical alphabet. So why is it that we look at C first? There are very good reasons for that, but it's not going to help you learning it. So you just have to accept the fact that, okay, C is where it all starts, and it just so happens that the frequencies and the way that the scales are made up, that C allows us to create something that sounds right for that particular Western music. Okay, so it all starts with C, and then we look at a thing called our circle of fifths to kind of update how these notes in relationship to each other kind of change the what we class as the number of flats or sharps, or just the way it's related to each other. Now if I straight away start with the fact that C starts here and I play all the white notes from here to here, I can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now that's the first starting point for anybody ever doing music. You know, if you're a kid that's going to primary school or whatever, we will always start with this. Okay? Now for a lot of people, when they're listening to rock music or pop music or whatever, this isn't cool because it doesn't sound like the music they're listening to. Okay? It's do a deer, a female deer, and it sounds like The Sound of Music, and you know it's kind of not cool. Okay, you've got to bear with that, and don't ask why. Just accept that is the way that it is. Okay. Now, if I count these up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's important first of all, because 8 is oct, and we can from 8 learn the term octave. So within the 8th note, within that particular range of white keys, the scale, that number 8 is where it all starts again, the octave. When I say start again, it's the same note but an octave higher. You can hear that straight away if I go. Okay? On the guitar, we're going to relate how we learn the fretboard to finding those octave points. Okay? It's very important. It's also important to be able to recognise that by singing it as well. La 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 la. Regardless of whether you have a singing voice or not, you need to internalise that note. Okay. Now if we count them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This gives us what we call our major scale. Our major scale sounds, and always will sound, like this. Okay? Now that's the building block of all music. And that particular major scale starts on this note here, next to the 2 black notes. It's C. Okay? And we count it up by saying C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now, that's all very well, but what about these funny black notes here? Well, these are very important in music as well, because these kind of are the in-between notes. They're the things that are going to give us derivatives of this particular, what we class as scale. Okay. Now the first thing to understand with that is that if we were to count up from each one of these notes, we can count that black note in. Each one of these divisions, okay, is known as a semitone. It's a halfway point. semitone. You'll notice as well that these two notes here and these two notes there, they don't have one of those black notes. Why? Because they don't. That is all you need to know. Don't ask the questions of it, just again accept the fact that that is the way that the frequencies and everything else work in the Western scale. Those two there, between C, D, E, F, so between E and F, G, A, B, C, B and C, they do not have one of these black notes, okay? These black notes. Now, these black notes all have a name, and that's the first confusing thing for everybody when they start music, because they have two names depending on what key you're in. Okay, now we don't need to look at the key you're in at the moment, but this is the interesting point. If I try to play starting anywhere else apart from on C, then the combination of the white notes changes. Let me prove that to you. Listen, if I start on this note here, doesn't sound like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And of course it won't do because we've changed the number of notes in between the intervals. So this is where you kind of can learn straight away what those intervals or the spaces in between are. So between here and here, we count up 2 semitones. 2 semitones is known as a tone. Tone. So we go tone, tone, semitone. Tone, 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 semitone. T, T, S, T, 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 S. Now we're armed with that little formula. So wherever I now put my finger on the keyboard or on the guitar, I can count up that formula and I will get the same musical note sound as my major scale. So let's see if that works. Let's go back to the note there, and that note there is E. C, D, E. Let's count up. 1, 2. Tone. 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 Semitone. So let's see if that works first of all. Perfect. That's the first half. So tone, tone, semitone. Tone, 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 semitone. See if we can remember that. Tone, 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 semitone. Go back down. Wrong. Okay? Always hear when you're hitting the wrong note. Then ask yourself, well, why did I get it wrong? Because I didn't go tone. So semitone down, tone, 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 semitone, tone, tone. Okay? Now that's starting on that point. That's the note of E. We can start anywhere else. Let's start on one of the black notes. Do exactly the same thing. This black note here would be known as either E flat or D sharp. Now as we get further into understanding how music theory works, then we'll understand that there are certain scales that don't exist. D sharp is one such scale, i.e. it's always called E flat. This is all to do with the circle of fifths, and I will do a circle of fifths vid, but there are hundreds of them on the internet, and the circle of fifths is an absolutely brilliant way of kind of making this into a foundation that you will always return to. But let's go back to this note. Let's not even worry about what the name of that note is, but let's worry about the fact that we've got those spaces. So the space was tone, that's 2. Another tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Okay? Do it again. Tone, tone, semitone. Tone, 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 semitone. That always sounds like the major scale. Now, why is that important? Because these are all known as intervals. The intervals have the name of the space. Let's go back to our C. Now, the important thing to realise straight away is that each one of these notes within that particular scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, has a number. The number of the sequence that they're in. Now that number also refers to something that we call the interval. The interval of the note within the scale. So, what we're driving at here is that the second note is known as the second. It's in the major scale, it's therefore the major second. The third note, 1, 2, 3, is the major third. The fourth note, major fourth. The fifth, this is known as the perfect fifth. A bit more about that in a different video when we talk about the circle of fifths. This is the sixth note. This is the seventh note. So major, 6 and 7, and back to the octave. Okay, the octave. Now, this gives us our major scale and the intervals within that particular scale. Okay. Why is this important? It's important because this is how we are going to start playing chords. Now, chords are basically playing 1, 2, 3 or more notes within our scale. And we start with the major scale because that's the easiest place to start. So what we do is we count the 1 and the 3 and the 5 and we place our fingers down. When you're doing this, if you're doing it on a keyboard, please don't do it like that. Use your thumb. There's a reason for that thumb being so important, and that's because it's a pivot point, so your whole hand can swivel around the thumb. In the same way that the thumb is really important on the guitar, because this is our pivot point for our fingers on the actual neck of the guitar. See how everything relates to each other musically. So what we've got to do is we can take out the 1, the 3 and the 5, i.e. 1, 2, 3 and the 5. Now this gives us a chord. This gives us the chord of C major. And it's constructed from number 1, number 3 and number 5 within the major scale. 1, 3 and 5. Okay? Now, here's a really important part of why we need to know the intervals within this particular series of notes, the major scale. Because what I can do in this scale is I can take the 1, the 3 and the 5 and I can move that shape to the next note up. And the next note up. And the next note up. And the next note up. The next note up. The next note up. And the next note. That gives us our octave. Now something very interesting happens here. I'm using the notes within the major scale. That's very important because that major scale that I'm in is a series of notes that we know harmonically will be related to each other and they sound a certain way. Now this is known as my diatonic chord sequence. Chord number 1 is me playing this, this, and this. 1, 3, and 5. Chord 2 is 2, 4, and 6. Chord 3 is 3, 5, and 7. Okay? Chord number 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, is note number 4, 6, and 1 again. Now remember that this is 1, so we're going to carry on counting from 1 as we move our fingers up. So the next chord, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is note number 5, note number 7, and note number 2 again. Okay? Note number 2. That's a D. But we're not interested in the note names at the moment. We're interested in the spacing between them, because this is going to apply to any key that we're in. Any key that we're in. We talked about resting points when you listened to music before in a couple of our other videos. That essentially is where we're thinking about key. Okay? Again, lots of stuff to get your head around, but don't ask too many questions at this point. Just count where those spaces in your major scale are. Same on guitar. Okay? Next one up, note number 6. Oops. Note number 6, note number 1, and note number 3. Next one up, 7, 2, and 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. And then we're back to 1, 3, and 5 again. Okay? Now these are all known as triads. But here's the interesting part about the triads. Whenever we are working out what the name of a chord is, or what the sound of the chord is, we must relate that back to the major scale of the note that we start the chord on. That's known as the root note. So, this is an interesting point straight away, and where many people fall at the first fence. If I start by going 1, 3, 5, and then move it to the next note up, 2, 4, and 6, this now takes on a different sound. Now, if I were to take this note, which is the note of D, and I refer to this from the same intervals that we would have in our tone, tone, semitone, which is classed as D major, you'll see I get these notes. Okay? Now, watch. Tone, tone, tone. No, did that wrong. What did I do? It's not tone, is it? It's tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Now, we said that a major scale must come from the notes 1, 3, and 5 within our major scale. We're playing in the major scale of D. That means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are these notes. That means that that note there is in the key of D, our third, our major third. So we play this and we get the sound of D major. Now this note here is not in our original key of C, because it didn't have any of the black notes in. So we played this note. Now this note here, if we refer to the D, is one flattened than the third. We call the one flattened a minor third. So this becomes the chord of D minor. So the difference between D minor and D major is one note, the third. Third, flattened third. Third, flattened third. Third, flattened third. So, we need to learn the names of the chords that make up our diatonic. The first is a major. The second is a minor. The third is another minor. The fourth is a major. The fifth is a major. The sixth is a minor. And the seventh is an odd chord because it's known as a diminished chord. Okay? More about that later on when we go back again. Now this is very, very important to remember because the same structure and format works in any single key that you're playing in. So where you start on your do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and we divvy those notes up in exactly the same way, these chords are known as the diatonic chords. They are constructed from the notes within the major scale. There are two things we need to learn. We need to learn the sound of the major scale. Now we know how to construct that because it's tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. But we also need to hear the sound of that. Then we need to divide it up by taking the 1, 3, 5 and then moving that up through the scale. Those chords, the diatonic chords, become our building block because we can play them in any order. We give those chords a name, the name of the interval within the major scale. Chord number 1, chord number 2, chord number 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. Okay? Now that's really important because if we divvy these chords up in particular orders, we essentially can start writing music. But here is a very, very important thing to say early on doors, and why so many people kind of scrub music theory. Because it all starts with the chords of the major scale, we get something that sounds very majory. Now, immediately, we start hearing that and thinking, this sounds a little bit like a nursery rhyme. It sounds a little bit naff. And it doesn't really sound like the music I'm listening to. Why? There's a really, really good reason for why. Most of the songs you're listening to on the radio, your iPad, or whatever, are not using the major scale to construct the sound of the melody that you're listening to. What they're using is a mode. Okay? Now, I'm going to make some videos about modes, and it's really important for anybody, not just guitarists, but the fundamental of a mode is the fact that all it's doing is saying these are the chords within the major scale. Chord 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But instead of starting our piece on chord number 1, we start on another chord that pulls our ear. By starting on another chord but still using the chords of the diatonic, but now in a different starting sequence, They still remain in the same sequence, but they're in a different starting sequence. We now have a modal chord pattern. That is therefore going to start to relate to the music that you're listening to. It's still the same theory, it's still exactly the same notes. All we're doing is starting it off at a different point in the major scale. We won't start looking at that now because that can be quite complicated immediately. But bear that in mind. So when everyone's talking about modes, all it is one note that you start within the major scale that you start from, and you work out what the chords are within the diatonic from that point onwards. Now we can get more complicated because the diatonic starts with looking at 1, 3 and 5. Now we can get a lot more complicated than that. We won't do it in this video, but we can actually go from 1, 3, 5 to add another note in there, which would be the 7th, and then a 9, and then an 11, and then a 13. Okay. Now, there's a good reason for why this works. We won't, as I say, go into it right now because this is really basic stuff to get you going. But all music theory falls under just 2 octaves. Any theory, even the most complicated jazz theory, fits under playing notes over a 2 octave range. Okay, so within that, and it's just playing the major scale within a 2 octave range. So let's start and play over a 2 octave range. Okay. Now, of course, I shouldn't be playing it like that if I'm looking at keyboards. What I should be doing is using the way that I should be playing the keys. So I should actually be using one finger. Okay, and then I run out. How does that work then? Well, actually, it's a slightly different way of doing it than this. What we have to do is 1, 2, 3, and then we can nip this finger underneath our thumb. Ready? And then we can use all of these. And then we can nip that across there. Okay? So if you are looking at keyboard and starting to play keyboards, then be aware that we can do this, where you put your thumb underneath. I'm sitting in a really funny angle, which is really not good for, because the camera's recording, but it's really not good for sitting at the keyboard because I'm literally right on at the angle there. But this is what we should be doing if we're looking at playing it on a keyboard. We should be looking at starting on our thumb, 1, 2, 3, snipping down there, so we can play it all the way like that. There are different permutations as we get into it, but essentially, yeah, that's not important. We're not looking at playing keyboards at the moment, but just something I thought I'd mention. So your major scale is where it all starts. Put your fingers down anywhere on your keyboard and see if you can make it sound that way. No, doesn't sound right. Doesn't sound right. So we could mess around with hearing where it is. That's one way we could do it. Or we could apply straight away the fact that we know it's tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So I should do that straight away because it'll make it easier for me. There's a note. Tone, tone, semitone. Tone, 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 semitone. And back again. So your first task in understanding how those chords work is to make sure that you're comfortable with playing the major scale. And that's the same on any instrument. Once we've got that sorted, we can start to work out where our intervals lie. And that's where we'll pick up next time.